Bell at Hardwick Cross was a posting inn on the Great North Road, and on the morning of the 7th of October, 1816, there were perhaps 40 people in its yard when a young woman was put up onto the roof of the northbound stage. That is the whole of the incident. Nobody struck anybody. Nobody raised a voice. A trunk was handed up, a fare was paid, and a woman of 24 climbed an iron ladder in the rain and sat down on a bench above the wheels with 3 other outside passengers and a coachman. It took about 90 seconds, and it was the most public thing that had ever happened to her. To understand why, you have to know what an outside seat was, and the modern mind has nothing to compare it to. A stagecoach carried 4 inside and 10 or 11 outside. Inside meant upholstery, a door, glass, and a roof. Outside meant a plank bench on the top of the vehicle, no restraint of any kind, in whatever weather there was, at 8 or 9 miles an hour, for as long as the journey took. The fare was less than half. That is the entire reason it existed. It is worth understanding the road itself, because in 1816, the Great North Road was the most modern thing in England, and nobody thinks of it that way now. 400 miles from London to Edinburgh, turnpiked almost the whole way, with a surface engineered by men whose names are still attached to it, and stages of 10 or 12 miles between inns where a fresh team was put to in under 2 minutes. That last figure is the whole achievement. A coach did not stop to rest horses. It stopped to exchange them. 4 fresh horses came out of the archway already harnessed, the traces were swapped, and the coach went on. A well-run change was 90 seconds, and the guard timed it with a watch that was sealed by the post office and could not be adjusted by anybody on the road. The result was a mail coach that averaged 8 or 9 miles an hour for 400 miles, day and night, in all weathers, to a printed timetable, which meant that for the first time in the history of these islands, an ordinary person could know, on Monday, what time a thing would arrive on Wednesday. The inns along it were not romantic either. The Bell at Hardwick Cross had stabling for 60 horses, a yard that could hold 3 coaches at once, an ostler establishment of 11 men, and an income that depended entirely on the coaches stopping there, and would vanish the moment they did not. Which they did 30 years later, when the railway came through, and the Bell closed in 1849, and the yard where all of this happened is now a car park. One detail of that system is worth having, because it explains the exactness of everything that follows. The guard on a mail coach carried a timepiece in a locked case. He could see the face and he could not touch the hands. The case was sealed at the post office and opened at the far end. At every stage he entered the time of arrival on a waybill. If the coach was late, the guard had to account for it in writing, and if the innkeeper had been slow with the horses, the innkeeper answered for it, which means that the Great North Road in 1816 was already running on measured, recorded, unarguable time. At a period when most of England still told the hour by a church clock that was wrong. That is why we can be exact about the morning of the 7th of October. The northbound stage left Hardwick Cross at 8 minutes past 8 and reached Doncaster at 18 minutes past 12, and both figures are on a waybill because a man with a sealed watch wrote them down. An outside passenger in October on the Great North Road was wet within the hour and stayed wet. There were passengers who died of exposure on that road most winters, and the newspapers reported it in the same tone they used for a dead horse. And it was not only uncomfortable, it was legible. Everybody in England could read a coach at a glance. Inside was a person of some standing, or a person spending beyond themselves. Outside was a servant, a tradesman, a soldier, a labourer, or a woman, with nobody to pay the difference. So when Grace Ellender was handed up the ladder at Hardwick Cross in the rain, in front of 40 people, every one of them was told her exact position in the world, without a word being spoken. The 40 people are worth naming as a class, because the audience for this mattered enormously, and none of them were gentry. There were 11 ostlers and yardmen. There was the innkeeper and his wife and 4 servants. There were the outside passengers already up, and the 4 inside, and the coachman and the guard. There were 2 carriers waiting with parcels, a horse dealer, and the usual dozen people who are in an inn yard at 8 in the morning, for no reason anybody could state. This is the point that the drawing rooms missed entirely, and that mattered far more than they did. The witnesses to that morning were working people, and working people on the Great North Road talked to working people at the next stage, and the next. A story that enters a coaching yard does not stay in a county. It goes up and down a 400-mile road at 9 miles an hour, at every change, in the mouths of ostlers. That is why it was in London in 6 days. And it is why it did not arrive in London as gossip about a woman, which is what a drawing-room story would have been, but as a story about a duke, because the people telling it were telling it about the only man in the yard whose behaviour was surprising. She had been at Wen Abbey for 5 weeks as companion to Lady Selina Harbottle. She was not staff. She was not family. She was the 4th daughter of a clergyman at Retford who had died owing money, which put her in the particular category the period had no honest word for, a gentlewoman without means, who lives in other people's houses doing what is asked and is described to visitors as a friend. Companions were not paid at Wen Abbey. That is worth stopping on. There were companions in England who drew a wage of £20 a year and were, in every practical sense, employees with the protections that implies. And there were companions like Grace Ellender, who received their board, their room, occasionally a gown, and nothing else, because a paid companion is a servant and an unpaid one is a guest, and the family very much preferred a guest. The difference between those 2 things was the only property she had. How a woman arrived in that position is worth setting out, because it happened to a great many people, and it happened fast. Her father was the Reverend Simeon Ellender, vicar of a parish outside Retford, on a living of about £210 a year. That is a comfortable, modest, respectable income, and it supported a household of 6. A living dies with the man who holds it. There is no pension and no widow's portion, and the parsonage belongs to the parish, and the new incumbent needs it. Simeon Ellender died in the November of 1812, aged 54, and it then emerged that he had borrowed against nothing at all. Twice, to keep 2 of his children in schooling, his son at Cambridge, and a younger boy who died before he could use any of it. The debts came to £480. There were no assets. His books were sold at Retford in the January and made £31. His widow went to a cousin at Newark. His son Josiah, who was 25 and newly ordained, took a curacy at £60. And Grace Ellender was 20 years old, well educated by her father with French and a good hand and no capital whatsoever, and there were in that England exactly two respectable things she could do. She could be a governess, which required a household with children and paid perhaps £25 a year, and was, by universal agreement, the worse of the two. Or she could be a companion, which paid nothing, and was better, because a companion is not staff. She was a companion in 4 households in 4 years before Wen Abbey. She has left no complaint about any of them, and the drafts of her letters are uniformly grateful. She read aloud in the afternoons. She wrote Lady Selina's letters. She walked with her, sat up with her when she could not sleep, carried her shawls, remembered the names of 40 neighbours, and made herself pleasant to a great many people who did not know her name. The hours are worth setting out, because the phrase paid companion suggests a light occupation, and this was not one. She was up before her employer and dressed before her, which, in a house running on country hours in October, meant 7. She was available from that moment until Lady Selina went up, which during a house party was frequently after midnight. There was no part of that day that was hers. A companion has no off-duty, because her duty is presence, and presence cannot be scheduled. If the household was occupied, she was not free. She was merely not currently required, which is a completely different condition, and every woman who has lived it says the same thing about it. And the work itself was constant low-grade judgment. Which of 2 visitors should be spoken to first? Whether a letter needed answering today, whether her employer wanted company or wanted the appearance of company. Getting any of that wrong was not punished, it was simply noticed, and being noticed is what a companion spends her whole life avoiding. For which she received a room, her meals, and in 5 weeks at Wen Abbey 1 length of grey stuff for a gown, which is recorded in the household book as a gift. For 5 weeks, and then the party at Wen Abbey broke up, as autumn parties did, and everybody went home. The 5 weeks themselves are documented better than anything else in her life, because Lady Selina kept a day book and Grace Ellender wrote most of the entries in it. That is not a joke. A companion's principal function in a house of that kind was to be the part of her employer's memory that could be written down, and the day book at Wen Abbey for September and October of 1816 is in Grace Ellender's hand throughout. It records who called, what was said, who was owed a letter, which of the 40 neighbouring families were on terms with which others, who had been ill, and what had been sent. It is a working document, and it is extremely good. Somebody reading it now can reconstruct the society of that corner of Nottinghamshire in the autumn of 1816 in a way that is simply not possible for most of England. Her own name appears in it 4 times in 5 weeks, always in the 3rd person, always as a detail of somebody else's arrangement. The entry for the 6th of October, the day the carriage was not offered, is in her hand as well. It records the departures for the following morning, lists Lady Selina's own route to Doncaster, and then, in the same even script, notes that a place had been taken on the northbound stage for Miss Ellender. She wrote that down herself, the evening before, in a book she had been keeping for 5 weeks. That is the sentence that people who work on this find hardest, and it is worth sitting with, because it is not humiliation as the modern imagination stages it. Nobody made her write it. It was her job. She was good at her job, and her job that evening included recording the arrangement that was being made about her. Here is what happened on the 6th of October, the day before the yard. Lady Selina Harbottle had a travelling carriage and was going to Doncaster, and Retford is 9 miles beyond Doncaster on the same road. She did not offer it. There was no scene, no refusal, nothing said. On the evening of the 6th, she told Grace Ellender, pleasantly, in front of 2 other guests, that she had written to the Bell to secure her a place on the northbound stage and had paid the fare, and that she hoped the weather would hold. She had paid for an outside seat. It cost her 4 shillings. An inside seat on that stage was 9 and 6, and the carriage would have cost her nothing at all, because it was going the same way with 2 empty places in it. Now, Lady Selina Harbottle was not a monster, and this account does not work if she is made into one. She was 61, she was a widow, and she had been companion herself for 11 years before she married, in a house in Northumberland where she had been treated in ways she referred to twice in her life and never described. Everybody who knew her said she was generous, and the parish accounts bear it out. What she was, precisely, is a woman who had spent her whole life being told exactly where she stood, and who had finally reached a position from which she could tell somebody else. She did not enjoy it. There is no evidence she thought about it at all. That is the point. Her own 11 years are recoverable in outline, and they explain more than they excuse. Selina Harbottle was born Selina Vane, the daughter of a Northumberland attorney, and went as companion at 19 to a connection of her mother's, a Mrs. Fenwick of Hexham, and stayed 11 years. The 2 things she said about it in her life were said to different people 20 years apart, and match exactly. She said that she had not been permitted to sit down in the drawing room unless there were visitors, and that she had gone 11 years without once being asked what she thought about anything. She married at 30, to a man 22 years older, and was a widow at 44 with an income and a house, and from that point onward she was, by every account in that county, kind to servants, generous to the parish, and scrupulous about her obligations. And she put a young woman on the roof of a stagecoach in the rain, and could not afterwards find the unkindness in it, and I do not think she was lying. The rule that had been applied to her for 11 years had become, in her hands, simply the way things were arranged. That is what a rule does to the people it is used on. It does not make them cruel. It makes them unable to see the thing at all, which is worse, because cruelty can at least be argued with. The 4 shillings was not cruelty. It was the accurate application of a rule that everybody in that house agreed with, including, in most respects, Grace Ellender. And the rule was this: a companion is not family, and the moment a party ends, she stops being anything at all. There were 4 other people in the yard at Hardwick Cross who had been at Wen Abbey, 2 guests going south, and Lady Selina's own maid and coachman waiting with the carriage. The carriage was standing there. That is the detail nobody who was present ever left out. Grace Ellender had her trunk handed up, paid nothing because the fare was paid, and climbed the ladder. And a man who had been standing under the arch of the yard with his hat in his hand for about 4 minutes said to the coachman that he would take an outside place as far as Doncaster. His name was Ash Carrow. He was the 5th Duke of Ravensmore, and he had a chaise and 4 standing in that same yard with his own arms on the door. He needs introducing properly, because a duke in a story like this is usually a device, and this one was a specific man with a specific reason for standing under that arch. He was the 2nd son. That is the first thing, and it explains a good deal. He had been brought up to expect nothing in particular, went into the Rifles at 19, served 4 years in the Peninsula, and came home in 1812 because his elder brother had died of a fever at Ravensmoor at the age of 31. So he inherited at 27 a title he had never been prepared for, a house he had not lived in since he was a boy, and 11,000 acres. Men who come into things that way are frequently bad at them. He was not. The Ravensmoor estate papers show a man who spent his first 4 years going through drainage, tenancies and roofs with an agent, and who reduced 11 rents in 1816, which was the failed harvest year, and did it before he was asked. What he was not good at was the other half of it. He disliked London, attended the Lords irregularly, and was described by a woman who knew him well as excellent company for about 40 minutes, and then plainly wanting to be somewhere else. And he was at Hardwicke Cross on the 7th of October for the flattest possible reason. He had been at Wen Abbey for the same 5 weeks. He was going north to Ravensmoor, and the Bell was where his own carriage had lain overnight. He had spoken to Grace Ellender perhaps 6 times in 5 weeks. Always in company, always about nothing. He said later that he could not have told anybody her Christian name on the 6th of October. The coachman said no, that has to be said first, because every version of this story leaves it out, and it is the most revealing thing in the whole yard. A duke does not ride outside. It is not a rule anybody had written down, in the way that the most powerful rules never are. And the coachman of the northbound stage, a man named Pargeter, who drove that stage for 19 years, understood immediately that he was being asked to permit something that would be remembered as his doing. He said the inside was empty, and his lordship was welcome to it, and he said it twice. Ashy Carrow paid 4 shillings for the outside place and climbed the ladder. The ladder is worth a moment because it is a real object, and it is the whole picture. Access to the roof of a stagecoach was by iron rungs let into the back of the body beside the boot, going up almost vertically, wet in that weather, with nothing to hold at the top but the seat rail. Women in the dress of 1816 went up them with one hand. It is not dignified. It was not intended to be. Everything about the outside of a coach was designed by people who assumed that anybody using it had already accepted a great deal. So the physical act at the center of this story is a man of 36 in a good coat, in front of 40 people who had all just watched him decline a warm, empty carriage of his own, climbing 4 wet iron rungs up the back of a public stage and sitting down on a plank. Pargeter the coachman, who had said no twice, then did the only thing left to him, which several people in that yard noticed, and which was reported for years afterward. He got down, off his box, walked round, and steadied the ladder while the Duke of Ravensmoor went up it. That is a man deciding, in about 4 seconds, which side of a thing he is on. Now let me tell you exactly what that cost, because it is very easy from here to read it as a gesture, and it was not a gesture. It was a fact about his standing that could not afterwards be removed. He was 36. He had been Duke of Ravensmoor for 9 years. He had 2,000 a year more than he could spend, a seat in the Lords he attended irregularly, and, this is the part that matters, an understanding with the family of a Miss Arabella Shane of Lincolnshire that was 3 years old and had not yet been announced. A man in that position does not do eccentric things in a coaching yard on the Great North Road, because a coaching yard on the Great North Road is the single most efficient distribution system for news in England. 40 people saw it. Within 6 days it was in Doncaster, Retford, Newark, and Lincoln, and within a fortnight it had reached London in the form it kept for 2 years, that Ravensmore had ridden the roof of a common stage in the rain beside a clergyman's daughter with no money. Nobody said he had done anything wrong. That is not how it worked. What was said in 100 drawing rooms in exactly the same amused tone was that it was very odd. Odd is the most expensive word in that language. A man of that rank has one asset that is not land, and it is that his behavior is predictable. Because predictability is what allows other families to plan around him, to seat him, to match him, to entrust things to him. Odd removes that. The way that cost was actually collected is worth watching, because it is nothing like a punishment and it is far more effective than one. Nobody wrote to him about it. Nobody refused him anything. He was not cut, snubbed, or criticized to his face by a single person in the whole of 1816 and 17. What happened is that he stopped being consulted. In the spring of 1816, he had been one of 4 men approached about a county committee to petition on the Corn Laws. In the spring of 1817, he was not approached, and the committee had 5 members. He had been asked every year since he inherited to stand as a steward at the Doncaster meeting. In 1817, he was not asked. 2 families with unmarried daughters who had invited him regularly invited him once each that season and made the party large. None of that is refusable, because none of it is stated. There is no letter to answer and no slight to resent. A man simply finds that the arrangements of his county are being made slightly to one side of him, and if he says anything about it at all, he sounds ridiculous, because nothing has happened. His agent, a man called Pike, who had served the family 30 years, put it to him directly in the March of 1817, and Ashe Caro's reply is in the estate letter book, because Pike filed everything. He wrote, "I am aware of it, I have been aware of it since November, and I would be obliged if you would continue to tell me when you notice it, because the day I stop noticing is the day I have begun pretending it did not cost anything." He knew it. He was not a romantic, and there is nothing in the record to suggest he was carried away. What there is a letter he wrote 9 days afterward to his cousin Hesketh Caro, which survives, and which says in part, "I was aware, while I was climbing it, what it would cost, and I did the sum on the ladder. I have not been able since to construct an account in which the price is too high, and I have tried, because I would rather have found one." The journey to Doncaster is 22 miles, and it took 4 hours and 10 minutes because of the state of the road at Barnby Moor. It rained for 3 of those hours. What was said between them is almost entirely unknown, and both of them were asked about it for the rest of their lives. What Grace Ellender said at 80 to a niece is the only account either of them gave. She said that he asked her whether she was warm enough, and she said yes, which was a lie, and that he said in that case she was the only person on that roof who was, and then he did not speak again for about an hour, and that after Barnby Moor he asked her what she had been reading to Lady Selina, and she told him, and he said that he had never got through it. And she said that was because he had been reading it to himself. She said they talked about books for the rest of the way to Doncaster, and that she could not remember one thing either of them had said about them. What is known about the rest of that journey comes from 3 of the other people on the roof, and it is worth having, because outside passengers are not a private audience. There were 3 others up there: a journeyman saddler going to Doncaster, a woman of about 50 travelling to her son, and a boy of 15 who was being sent to an apprenticeship at Ferrybridge, and who lived until 1901 and told the story for 80 years. His account, given to a local paper when he was 90, is the one that has the detail nobody invents. He said the Duke gave the woman travelling to her son his own greatcoat about an hour out of Hardwick Cross, and that she refused it twice and took it the 3rd time, and that he then sat the remaining 3 hours in the rain in a coat that was not designed for it. He said that at Barnby Moor, where the road was bad and everybody had to get down and walk while the coach was got through, the Duke carried the saddler's box as well as his own, and he said the thing that the family at Ravensmoor has repeated ever since, that none of the 4 of them knew who he was until Doncaster, when the innkeeper came out and used his title, and that the woman with the greatcoat then tried to give it back, and he would not have it. So for 4 hours and 10 minutes, on that roof, he was a man in a wet coat, and Grace Ellender talked to him about books on those terms, which is the only 4 hours in the entire story when the 2 of them were in the same position. The other 3 did not vanish afterwards, and 2 of them turn up again. The woman who took the greatcoat was a widow named Anne Sowerby, travelling from Newark to a son at Ferrybridge. She sent the coat back to Ravensmoor by carrier the following week, cleaned, with a note that has not survived. In 1823, her granddaughter was one of the first 19 children in the school at Ravensmoor Parva, and the family maintained afterwards that this was a coincidence, and it may have been. The saddler was a man named Job Redfern of Doncaster, and he is the reason the story reached print at all. He told it in a Doncaster shop for the next 40 years, and a local antiquarian wrote it down from him in 1852, which is the earliest written account of that morning by anybody who was on the roof. And the boy of 15 was Eli Marchbank, apprenticed to a wheelwright at Ferrybridge, who lived to 99 and outlived every other person in this story by 30 years. It was Marchbank, in 1900, who was asked whether he had understood at the time that he was watching anything unusual. He said he had not, and that what he remembered was simply being cold, and that the thing he had thought about afterwards for 80 years was not the Duke at all. It was that nobody in that yard, including him, had thought there was anything wrong with a woman being put up there in the first place. She said afterwards that she had known perfectly well who he was, having seen him at Wen Abbey, and that she did not tell the others, and that she has never been able to explain why not. At Doncaster he got down, handed her trunk to the Retford carrier himself, and went back to Hardwick Cross for his own carriage, which is another 22 miles, so that his one act of 4 shillings cost him a day. And here is the part that people find hardest to believe, and the parish register at Retford settles it. He did not call on her, not that week, not that month, not for 11 months. Now, the 11 months. This is the section every telling skips, and it is where the story actually happens. Grace Ellender went home to a house in Retford that was her elder sister's, where she was the unmarried aunt, and she had been there before and knew exactly what it was. Her sister Maria had 4 children under 9, and a husband who was a corn factor with a business that was not doing well, and who did not want a fifth adult in a house with 6 rooms. She was not unwelcome. It is important to be exact. Her sister loved her, wrote to her while she was away, and was glad to see her. And there was nowhere for her to sleep except a truckle inn with the 2 girls. And there was no money, and everybody in that house knew that the arrangement could not be permanent, and nobody could say what would replace it. She wrote 4 letters in that autumn to families in Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire, offering herself as a companion, and she has left the drafts, and they are the most painful documents in this story. The house at Retford should be described, because 11 months is a long time, and the modern reader tends to picture something more comfortable than it was. 6 rooms. Her sister Maria, her brother-in-law Thomas Bidwell, 4 children between 1 and 9, and a girl of 13 who came in daily. Grace slept on a truckle bed in the room with the 2 girls, which was taken up in the morning and put down at night, and she had no room of her own and no drawer of her own, and kept everything she owned in the trunk that had come off the coach. The corn business was going badly. 1816 is the year without a summer. The Tambora eruption in the Indies had put enough dust into the atmosphere to fail harvests across the northern hemisphere, and a corn factor in the winter of 1816 was a man watching prices do things that ruined his customers and then him. So there was no money, and there was a 5th adult, and everybody was decent about it, and the decency was itself exhausting. What she did with those 11 months, apart from write 4 letters, is the thing that turns out to have mattered. She taught the 4 children. Not as an arrangement and not for anything, she taught them because she was there and they were there, and she had been well taught herself. 2 of those 4 children are worth following. The eldest, Maria's daughter Hannah, kept a school at Retford for 31 years from 1829. The second, Thomas, went into his father's trade, rebuilt it, and was mayor of Retford twice. Grace Ellender always said that the 11 months in that house were the worst of her life, and that she would not have given them up, and both halves of that were true. What she thought about him during those 11 months is a fair question, and the honest answer is that we do not know, because she left nothing. There is no diary for those months. The 4 letters offering herself as a companion do not mention him. Her sister Maria, asked about it decades afterwards, said that Grace had never once spoken his name in that house in 11 months, and Maria plainly regarded this as evidence of nothing at all. The only thing she ever said about that period, and she said it when she was 72 to a granddaughter who asked her directly whether she had been waiting, is worth quoting exactly, because it is not the answer the question was fishing for. She said that she had not been waiting, because waiting requires believing that something is coming, and that she had believed nothing was coming, and had been perfectly correct to believe it, since nothing did come for 11 months. Then she said the part that the family has kept. She said that what the coach roof had given her was not hope and not a suitor. It was 4 hours in which somebody had talked to her about books, without once adjusting himself to the fact that she was a paid companion, and that she had gone back over those 4 hours in her sister's house all winter, not because of the man, but because she had needed to keep hold of the evidence that being spoken to that way was a thing that could happen to her. A woman on a truckle bed, teaching 4 children for nothing, holding on to 4 hours as proof that she existed at the level she had always privately believed she existed at. That is what he had actually handed her in that yard, and he did not know he had done it. And and she never told him. They are careful, modest, and they enumerate her qualifications: French, a good hand, reading aloud, some music, a knowledge of household accounts, and, this is in 3 of the 4, a willingness to be useful in any way that is required. 2 were not answered. 1 was answered with regret. The 4th was answered with an offer of a position in Lincolnshire at no salary, board only, to a lady of 81. She accepted it, and then in the January she did not go, and the reason she did not go is the reason there is a story. Because by the January the coach had done its work. A story travels along a coach road the way water travels down a hill, and it does not travel in one direction only. It went south to London as an amusing item about a duke. It went north and east into Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire as something else entirely, because in those counties people knew who the woman on the roof was. By December, everybody within 30 miles of Retford knew that Grace Ellender had been put outside in the rain by Lady Selina Harbottle with an empty carriage standing in the same yard. And that is the thing Lady Selina had not calculated, because it had never once occurred to her that anybody would be watching. What happened to her is not dramatic, and it took about 4 months. She was not cut. Nobody in that county was going to cut a woman of her position over a coach fare. What happened is subtler and worse. Invitations began to be issued to her that were correct and no more. The dinners where a matter is actually settled stopped including her. 2 families who had asked her every autumn for a decade asked her once and did not repeat it. She noticed by February. She wrote to a friend in Northumberland in the March, and the letter survives because that family kept everything, and there are 2 sentences in it that are the whole of her. She wrote, "I am told I have been unkind, and I have gone over it 100 times, and I cannot find the unkindness. I paid her fare, which nobody required of me. She never did see it. She died in 1829, and there is no evidence she ever understood what she had done. And I want to be careful here, because it would be very satisfying to say that she got what she deserved, and it is not true. She did something ordinary in a world that permitted it, in front of one person who did not, and she paid a price that the same act had never carried before. The price was not justice. It was weather. Meanwhile, at Ravensmoor, Ashy Carrow was doing nothing, and the doing of nothing took 11 months and cost him a great deal. The Shane understanding came apart in the February. It came apart carefully and by mutual agreement, and there was never a word of it in any newspaper, which is how those things were done when both families wanted to remain on terms. What actually happened is that he went to Lincolnshire in the January and told Sir Marmaduke Cheyne the truth, which was the one thing nobody expected of him, and which several people thought was unnecessary. He could have let it lapse. Understandings of that kind lapsed constantly and silently. There was no contract, no announcement had been made, and either family could simply have allowed 2 years to pass. He did not do that. He told Sir Marmaduke that he had done a thing in a coaching yard in October that he did not regret and would do again, that he was aware of what it had cost his standing, and that he was not prepared to let a marriage go forward in which the Cheynes had not been told what they were joining themselves to. Then he offered to have the ending put out in whatever form protected Arabella Cheyne best, including one in which he was refused. Sir Marmaduke declined that on the grounds that his daughter would not have it, and the two families put out nothing at all, which is why there is no notice anywhere, and why the whole thing has to be reconstructed from letters. Arabella Shane was told the substance of it by her father the same week. She was 22. Her own letter to a cousin, written 4 days later, survives, and it is not gracious, and there is no reason it should be. She wrote that she had been made a fool of by a man who had discovered a conscience 11 months into an understanding of 3 years, and that she wished him joy of the roof of a stagecoach. She was entitled to every word of that, and the fact that she came round to a different view 50 years later does not cancel it. Arabella Shane married a baronet in 1818 and lived to be 79, and when she was old she was asked about Ravensmoor by a niece who had heard the coach story, and what she said is quoted at Ravensmoor to this day. She said, "He was honest with my father in a way that cost him more than it cost me, and I was 22 and furious for about a year, and then I was married and happy, and I have thought of it since as the luckiest escape either of us ever had." His mother did not speak to him for 7 months. His agent wrote him 3 letters about the Lincolnshire tenancies that were not really about the Lincolnshire tenancies, and a man he had been at Harrow with wrote him a letter in the April that Ashe Carrow kept for 50 years, which said, in its entirety they are saying you have made yourself ridiculous. I am told you know. I write only to say that I have thought about it a great deal, and I find I do not think you have. And through the whole of it he did not write to Grace Ellender, and he did not call, and he did not send anything. He was asked why, eventually, and his answer is the one thing in this account that is genuinely difficult, and I am going to give it to you as he gave it. He said that a woman in her position could not refuse him. Not could not want to, could not. A clergyman's daughter with no money, on a truckle bed in her sister's house, offered marriage by a duke, has one available answer. And it is not an answer. It is a surrender to arithmetic. And he said that he had understood on the roof of that coach that if he asked her in the October, he would never afterwards know what she had actually thought, and neither would she. So he waited for her to have somewhere else to stand. That sounds noble, and he did not present it as noble. What he said in the same conversation is that it was also the coward's course, because it left her in her sister's house for 11 months while he protected his own conscience, and that he was aware of that at the time, and did it anyway. What he did instead was the only thing available that did not put her under an obligation, and it took him until the June to arrange, and she did not learn about it for 2 years. The living at Ravensmoor Parva fell vacant in the May of 1817. It is a small living, about £140 a year, in his gift as patron, and he gave it to a curate named Josiah Ellender. Josiah Ellender was Grace's brother. He was 29. He had been a curate at Gainsborough for 6 years, on £60 a year, with no prospect of advancement, and he was, by every account, including his bishop's, extremely good at his work, and completely without patrons. Ashe Carrow had the living examined by his agent, satisfied himself that the man was fit for it, and gave it to him, and gave no reason, and attached no condition. And a brother with £140 a year and a parsonage has a spare room. By the August of 1817, Grace Ellender was living at Ravensmoor Parva Parsonage, 4 miles from Ravensmoor House, in her brother's household, with an income of nothing but a roof that was not conditional on her being useful to anybody. which is precisely and exactly what she had not had at any point in her adult life. He called on the 14th of September, 1817, which is 11 months and 1 week after the coaching yard. He called on her brother correctly and was received in a parsonage parlor with Josiah Ellender present, and he stayed 40 minutes and talked about the roof of the chancel, which genuinely needed work. Then he came the following week, and the week after that. 6 calls before he said anything. The 6 calls are worth going through, because the courtship in this story is 4 hours on a coach roof, and then 6 afternoons in a parsonage, and that is all there ever was. The first was the chancel roof, which needed 11 pounds of work, and got it. The second, a week later, he brought a book he had said he would bring, which is the only message either of them could send, because a man may not write to an unmarried woman, and a parcel from a duke to a parsonage would have been the talk of the county inside a day. On the third, he stayed 1 hour and 40 minutes and talked to Josiah Ellender about the Ravensmoor Parva School, which did not yet exist, and which was, at that point, a thing the curate wanted and could not afford. The fourth was the one Grace Ellender described 60 years later as the afternoon she stopped being careful. He had brought nothing, said nothing of any consequence, and sat in a parsonage parlor for 1 hour while she and her brother argued about a translation, and joined in on her brother's side, and was beaten. The fifth was in the garden and lasted 20 minutes, and her brother was present throughout. And the 6th is where he told her about the living. One thing about those 6 weeks is worth stating plainly. Because the whole county was counting, he called on a Tuesday every time, at the same hour, and he came in his own carriage with his arms on the door, up a village street, in the middle of the afternoon. He had spent 11 months not writing to her in order to protect her from an obligation. When he did come, he made no attempt whatever to be discreet about it, and that was deliberate, and it is the same instinct as the latter. On the 6th, in the parsonage garden with her brother, at the other end of it pruning something he did not need to prune, Ashi Caro told Grace Ellender what he had done about the living, which she had not known, and why he had waited 11 months, and then he asked her. Her answer is the reason this story is told at Ravensmoor rather than forgotten. She said no. Not as a maneuver, and not from wounded pride. What she said, and she repeated it in almost the same words 60 years later, is that she had spent 11 months finding out what she thought when nobody was watching her, and that she would not now say yes in a garden 4 minutes after being told that the roof over her head had been arranged by the man asking. She told him she would give him an answer in the spring, and that in the meantime he was not to alter anything, and that if he took the living back off her brother, she would know exactly what kind of man he was. He said that was fair. He is reported to have said it immediately, without any argument at all, which several people who knew him thought was the most surprising thing he ever did. The 7 months between the refusal and the wedding are the part of this that the family has always been proudest of, and it is entirely her doing. She did not spend them being courted. She spent them working out whether she could stand on her own ground, and she went about it in the most practical way available to a woman with no money. In the October of 1817, she began teaching 4 children of the parish alongside her brother's own duties in the parsonage kitchen for nothing. By the January, there were 11. By the March, there were 19, and the vestry had given her the use of a room. That is the school at Ravensmoor Parva, which had 130 children in it when she died, and it existed 6 months before she was a duchess, and it was hers, before it was anybody else's. She said afterwards, and she said it more than once, that she gave him her answer in the April and not in the September, because in September the only true answer available to her was yes, and an answer that has only one available value is not an answer. By April, she had 19 children in a room, and a brother with a living and a roof that did not depend on being agreeable to anybody. And then she said yes, and everybody involved understood exactly what the difference was. They were married on the 11th of April, 1818, at Ravensmoor Parva, by her brother. Now the rest, because a wedding is not an ending, and the 31 years after it, are where you find out whether any of it meant anything. The county did not forgive it quickly. The Duchess of Ravensmoor was a clergyman's daughter who had been put outside on a stagecoach, and that was said in drawing rooms in 3 counties for the better part of 20 years, sometimes affectionately and sometimes not. She was never fashionable, and appears to have made no attempt to be. She went to London twice in 31 years. What she did instead is on paper in the estate books, and it is unglamorous and it is enormous. She took over the Ravensmoor charities in 1821 and ran them until she died. When she took them, there were 4 almshouses and a coal fund. When she died, there were 11 almshouses, a coal fund, a lying-in fund for the wives of labourers, and a school at Ravensmoor Parva with 130 children in it. And there is one line in the household accounts from 1822 onward that everybody who works on that family stops at. It is a standing sum, renewed every year for 31 years, entered as fares. It paid the inside fare for any woman travelling alone on the northbound or southbound stage from Hardwick Cross who could not pay the difference herself. The arrangement was with the bell, it was never advertised, and the innkeeper was instructed to say only that it had been settled. The mechanics of it were worked out with some care, and the care is the interesting part. It was not charity administered by a lady. Grace Carrow never saw a name, never approved a case, and had no involvement in any individual journey at all. The innkeeper at the bell held a float, made the decision himself on the spot, and rendered an account quarterly. There were 3 rules, and they are in the estate letter book. No woman was to be asked why she could not pay. No woman was to be asked her name. And the innkeeper was not to say who had settled it, and if pressed was to say that it was the house's custom. The reason for the 3rd rule is obvious once stated. A woman who knows she has been paid for by the Duchess of Ravensmoor has been given something, and is thereby placed. A woman who is told it is the custom of the house has simply been allowed inside. 2 innkeepers ran it over 31 years, and both kept the rules. The second one, a man named Alwyn Tester, was asked about it directly in 1855 by somebody writing about coaching, and said that he had settled a great many fares for the house over the years, and that was all he had to say about it. And that was all he ever said. By the estate's own count, it paid for something over 900 journeys. The rest of the 31 years is worth having in the same flat way, because it is where the county's opinion actually turned, and it turned slowly and for unromantic reasons. The school first. It took children of labourers and of tenants without distinction, which was not universal in that county, and it taught girls the same hours as boys, which was rarer still. 11 of its pupils went on to keep schools of their own. The lying-in fund, begun in 1826, paid a woman 2 shillings a week for 4 weeks after her birth, so that she did not have to be back in the fields. It is the least visible thing on this list, and the estate's own mortality figures for infants fall by about a third in the 15 years after it started, which may or may not be attributable and which the family has never claimed. The almshouses went from 4 to 11, and the rule for them was written by her, that a place was not to be given or withheld on account of anything the applicant had ever done. And she ran the whole of it out of a room at Ravensmoor with an account book, and the account book is why we know any of it, because it is complete for 31 years. The county came round in the end, and it did not come round because she was charming. It came round because she was, over 3 decades, extremely difficult to argue with about anything factual, and because a great many families in that part of Nottinghamshire eventually had somebody in the school or the almshouses or the fund. There were houses that were correct with her for 30 years and never warm. She mentioned it once to her eldest daughter, and what she said was that she had been put outside once in front of 40 people and had survived it, and that a cool drawing room was not going to trouble a woman who had done that. 900 women who got inside a coach in the rain and were told nothing except that it had been settled. She never explained it and never had to. Everybody at Ravensmoor knew exactly what it was. Ashe Caro died in 1849. She outlived him by 22 years and died in 1871 at 79. She left instructions for her own memorial, which is on the north wall of Ravensmoor Parva Church, and she chose the wording herself in 1864. It gives her name, the dates, and one line underneath. It says she was put outside. A&A man climbed up. The family objected. 2 of her sons thought it undignified and said so in writing, and she overruled them, and it is cut in the stone, and it is still there. There is a coda to the memorial that is worth having, because it is the last thing that happened, and nobody planned it. In 1894, the church at Ravensmoor Parva was reordered, and the north wall was to be replastered, and the memorial was scheduled to be taken down and reset in the porch, which is what was done with a great many Victorian tablets. It was stopped by the parish, not by the family. The objection was got up by the schoolmistress at Ravensmoor Parva and signed by 61 people, and the churchwarden's minute records the grounds given, which were that the tablet should stay on the wall of the church where the school children could read it. The schoolmistress who organized it had been taught in that school. So had 30 of the signatories. So a woman who had been put outside a coach in 1816 was kept on the inside wall of a church in 1894 by 61 people, most of whom could read because of a room she started in a parsonage kitchen for nothing, while she was deciding whether to marry a duke. It is still on that wall. Now, the thing this is actually about, and it is not the coach. Look at what he did, and more importantly, at what he did not do. He did not pay her fare. He could have. He had the money in his pocket, and it would have cost him 9 and 6 and 30 seconds, and nobody in that yard would have thought anything about it at all. And she would have gone inside, alone, and arrived at Doncaster having been rescued by a stranger. And it would have changed precisely nothing about her position, because a woman whose fare is paid by a duke is a woman who has been given something, and being given something is the condition she was already in. He did not fix it. He joined it. He got up onto the same bench in the same rain and took the same 4-shilling seat, and by doing that, he did not relieve her of her position. He made her position untenable for everybody else, because the moment a duke is sitting on that bench, the bench is no longer a statement about the people on it. That is the whole mechanism, and it costs more than money, which is exactly why it works. Money would have solved her afternoon. Standing solved the thing itself, and standing is the only currency that cannot be given away without being spent. There is somebody near you who has been put outside, not cruelly, by a rule that everybody in the room agrees with, applied accurately, by people who would be genuinely upset to be told they had done anything at all. You can pay their fare. It is quick, it costs you nothing you will miss, and it will change nothing. Or you can go and sit where they are sitting, in front of everybody, and let it be seen. Where would you be willing to be seen sitting?